He had won the impossible, but the war was far from saved. The Continental Army had stunned the world with its Christmas night triumph at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers and proving that American forces could defeat professional European troops when circumstances favored boldness over caution. But victory brought only temporary reprieve, not permanent salvation for revolutionary cause that remained desperately weak militarily despite psychological boost that Trenton provided to colonial morale and British anxieties about their invincible reputation. Washington understood that one battle changed nothing strategically. British forces in New York still vastly outnumbered Continental Army that had barely 3,000 effective soldiers after Trenton, most exhausted from their ordeal, crossing the Delaware and marching through winter storm to attack sleeping garrison. Supplies remained scarce, enlistments were still expiring at alarming rate, and British commanders would surely respond with overwhelming force once shock of Trenton wore off and professional pride demanded revenge for humiliating defeat. The general faced impossible choice that defined his leadership throughout the Revolution. He could retreat back across the Delaware to safety of Pennsylvania, preserving his army, but surrendering all momentum and psychological advantage that Trenton had created. Or he could press his luck before British recovered, attempting another strike that might compound enemy confusion, but risked destroying Continental Army if gamble failed, and British forces caught Americans in vulnerable position. Washington chose audacity over safety, as he usually did when circumstances demanded bold action rather than prudent caution. The exhausted Continental Army would not rest long after Trenton before their general asked them to risk everything again in campaign that would test whether Christmas miracle could be repeated or whether fortune would finally abandon revolutionary cause to British vengeance. The lion finally woke. General Charles Cornwallis had been preparing to sail home to England when news of Trenton reached New York headquarters, shattering British confidence and demanding immediate response to disaster that threatened to unravel entire military position in New Jersey. He cancelled his voyage and marched south from New Brunswick with 8,000 veteran troops, determined to crush Washington's impudent rebel force once and for all and restore British military reputation that Hessian surrender had damaged severely. Cornwallis was a capable commander who took American threats seriously after Trenton demonstrated that underestimating colonial forces led to humiliating defeats that emboldened rebellion and undermined British authority. He moved quickly, with overwhelming force, intending to trap Washington against the Delaware River and destroy Continental Army through superior numbers and professional discipline that should prevail in any fair fight between trained British regulars and amateur American soldiers, who had won at Trenton through surprise rather than military prowess. Washington's army was cold, hungry, and outnumbered 4-1 by approaching British force that represented everything. Continental soldiers feared disciplined ranks, experienced officers, adequate supplies, and grim determination to avenge Trenton through annihilation of rebel army that had dared to attack while British slept. American soldiers prepared defensive positions along Assunpink Creek near Trenton, understanding that they faced possible destruction if they could not hold against vastly superior force. The Continental Army braced for annihilation that seemed inevitable once Cornwallis arrived with forces large enough to sweep aside American defensive line and crush rebellion before it could recover from desperate gambles that had brought temporary success but left Washington's army exposed and vulnerable to British counterattack. The river became their last line of hope. On January 2, 1777, Cornwallis attacked across Assunpink Creek with confidence that American resistance would collapse quickly under pressure from professional soldiers executing coordinated assault. But Continental forces held their positions with determination born from knowledge that retreat was impossible and defeat would mean end of revolution as organized military resistance. The fighting was brutal, as British troops attempted repeatedly to force crossing against American artillery and musket fire that turned Creek into killing ground, where attackers faced concentrated defensive fire without adequate cover. Continental soldiers who had run from British forces in previous battles now stood firm, partly from improved morale after Trenton, and partly from understanding that running would accomplish nothing when Delaware River blocked escape route and British forces would pursue fleeing army to complete destruction. British attacks were repelled after hours of fighting that cost both sides casualties, but accomplished nothing strategically for Cornwallis, except confirming that Americans could not be dislodged easily from defensive positions despite British numerical superiority. The Americans held through combination of favorable terrain, effective artillery placement, and desperate courage that transformed soldiers who had seemed defeated just weeks earlier into troops capable of standing against British regulars in direct combat. But everyone understood that American success was temporary. British forces remained strong and determined while Continental Army was exhausted and running low on ammunition after day-long battle. Cornwallis could resume attacks tomorrow with fresh troops, while Americans had no reserves and no escape route if British pressure broke their defensive line through sheer weight of numbers and professional persistence. Cornwallis smiled. "We've got the old fox at last." The British commander surveyed battlefield with satisfaction, confident that Washington was trapped between his army and Delaware River with no escape route and no possibility of withstanding another day of assaults that would inevitably break American defensive line. He decided to wait until dawn for final attack, preferring to destroy Continental Army in daylight battle, where British discipline and superior numbers would produce complete victory rather than costly night fighting that might allow some Americans to escape through darkness and confusion. British encirclement seemed perfect from Cornwallis's perspective. American forces were pinned against creek with British army in front and river behind, unable to retreat without crossing Delaware under fire, and unable to hold positions indefinitely against sustained British pressure that would eventually overwhelm defensive line through attrition, if not through single decisive assault. Victory appeared certain, merely delayed until morning, when British forces could advance with proper coordination and overwhelming power. Tension mounted as night fell, and both armies prepared for decisive battle that would determine whether revolution survived or collapsed under British hammerblow that had been building since Trenton provoked Cornwallis into personal intervention. British soldiers slept confidently, expecting easy victory over trapped enemy who had nowhere to run and insufficient strength to resist determined attack. American soldiers tried to rest while wondering whether they would survive tomorrow's battle or whether their gamble at Trenton would be their last act before British vengeance destroyed what remained of Continental Army. The British prepared to strike at dawn, assuming that Washington would wait for attack he could not avoid. They were wrong about that assumption, as they had been wrong about so many things concerning this persistent colonial general who refused to accept defeat even when circumstances made defeat appear inevitable and inescapable. By firelight, Washington gambled everything. He gathered his officers for council of war, where conventional military wisdom said they should surrender or attempt desperate river crossing that would probably fail under British fire. But Washington proposed third option that seemed madness at first hearing escape Cornwallis's trap by marching around British flank during night, leaving campfires burning to deceive enemy into thinking American army remained in position and striking British rearguard at Princeton before Cornwallis could react to maneuver he would not discover until morning. The plan required perfect execution of nighttime march along unfamiliar roads through freezing temperatures, while maintaining absolute silence to avoid alerting British sentries who would raise alarm if they detected American movement. It required timing precise enough to reach Princeton at dawn when British garrison would be vulnerable to surprise attack. It required audacity beyond anything Washington had yet attempted, combining deception with offensive action in ways that defied military convention about how outnumbered armies should behave when trapped by superior forces. Leadership under pressure reveals character that comfortable circumstances conceal. Washington demonstrated genius for recognizing that audacity offered better chance than caution when circumstances seemed hopeless, that bold action could create opportunities that careful defensive strategy could never achieve. His officers agreed to the plan despite misgivings, trusting general who had proven at Trenton that impossible victories could be won through courage and surprise, when conventional approaches promised only defeat. The council in the cold became moment where revolution's fate turned on single decision to attempt escape that might fail catastrophically or succeed brilliantly, with no middle ground between outcomes. Washington bet everything on his ability to outmaneuver Cornwallis through combination of deception and speed that would leave British commander confused and frustrated, while American army struck unexpected blow against enemy rear. They left their fires burning and vanished into the night. The Continental Army executed one of history's most daring military maneuvers, slipping away from Cornwallis's encirclement through darkness while campfires blazed brightly to suggest continued American presence in defensive positions along Assunpink Creek. Soldiers moved in absolute silence, warned that single careless noise could alert British sentries and doom entire operation to disaster. The nighttime escape through freezing mud and backroads toward Princeton tested men who were already exhausted from previous battle and weeks of campaigning in winter conditions that would have broken less determined army. Roads were frozen hard enough to make artillery movement barely possible, but recent thaw had created mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels with every step. Men moved like ghosts through darkness, guided by officers who navigated by instinct and occasional glimpses of stars when clouds permitted. Boots wrapped in rags, muffled sound of thousands of soldiers marching past, British positions close enough that sentries might have heard column if wind had been blowing wrong direction, or if single soldier had stumbled loudly, or if wheel had broken with crash that would have carried through night air to alert enemies. The march required faith that plan would work, and that morning would find them behind British lines, rather than discovered and destroyed by Cornwallis's superior force. The silent march to Princeton became legendary example of what disciplined troops could achieve through courage and coordination under impossible conditions. Every soldier understood stakes of maintaining silence and continuing forward despite exhaustion and cold that made every step agony. They moved in silence, not from orders alone, but from shared commitment to cause that made personal suffering acceptable price for chance at victory. While Cornwallis slept, another battle began. British forces left behind at Princeton. The 17th, 40th, and 55th Regiments had no warning that death was marching toward them through winter darkness. These troops guarded supplies and communications, performing routine garrison duty in rear area that seemed safe from American forces supposedly trapped at Trenton. Officers and soldiers slept soundly, assuming that war was happening elsewhere, and that morning would bring news of Washington's defeat and British restoration of control over New Jersey. The British rearguard was a competent force of professional soldiers who would fight effectively if given time to form proper defensive lines and execute coordinated tactics. But they were unprepared for surprise attack at dawn, scattered in various positions throughout Princeton, without centralized command or defensive preparations adequate to resist determined assault. Their fate turned on few miles of frozen road and hours of darkness that Washington's army used to approach undetected while British slept, and Cornwallis remained ignorant of maneuver that was leaving him isolated from his supply base. Fate turns on such moments, commanders making reasonable assumptions that prove catastrophically wrong, soldiers sleeping peacefully hours before battles that will kill them, wars pivoting on night marches and surprise attacks that succeed because enemies make logical decisions based on incomplete information. Princeton garrison had no reason to expect attack, and every reason to feel secure in rear area, protected by Cornwallis's main force, supposedly destroying Washington's trapped army. But war rewards boldness and punishes complacency, and British rearguard was about to learn that lesson through brutal morning combat against enemy that should not have been there, but was marching toward them with determination to achieve another impossible victory. The first shots of dawn broke the silence. American vanguard under General Hugh Mercer encountered British troops near William Clark's Orchard on Princeton's outskirts, as both forces maneuvered for advantage in unexpected meeting engagement that neither had anticipated. The skirmish escalated quickly into fierce combat, as British regulars recognized opportunity to stop American advance before it could threaten Princeton garrison, while American troops understood they needed to clear this obstacle before British reinforcements could arrive from town. Mercer led heroic stand against British regulars who fought with professional discipline that initially overwhelmed American resistance. The fighting was close and desperate as British bayonets drove forward against American line that struggled to maintain formation under pressure from troops executing textbook infantry assault. Mercer fell mortally wounded, bayoneted multiple times by British soldiers who showed no mercy to American general who had been British officer before the revolution made enemies of former comrades. The American line nearly collapsed as Mercer's troops broke under British assault and began retreating in disorder that threatened to turn into rout if panic spread through Continental ranks. Officers struggled to maintain control while British pressed their advantage, sensing complete victory if they could shatter American morale before reinforcements arrived. The moment crystallized everything that made warfare unpredictable. Trained soldiers executing proper tactics against less disciplined opponents should have produced clear British victory, but battles often turn on factors beyond training and tactics. Mercer's fall and near collapse of American line represented brink of disaster that would have doomed Princeton attack and possibly destroyed Washington's army if British could exploit their initial success. The revolution hung by thread as American troops wavered between continuing fight and fleeing from professional soldiers who were demonstrating superiority that months of defeats had taught Continental forces to fear and expect. The line broke, and the revolution hung by a thread. American troops fled from British bayonet charge that had killed their general and shattered their formation, running in panic that infected surrounding units and threatened to transform tactical setback into complete disaster. Officers shouted orders that terrified soldiers ignored, focused only on escaping British regulars who pursued with ruthless efficiency and confidence that they were winning another easy victory against colonial amateurs who could not stand against professional European soldiers in direct combat. Chaos and fear dominated battlefield as American resistance dissolved under British pressure that seemed to confirm every lesson of previous defeats that Continental soldiers could not match British regulars in conventional battle, that training and discipline mattered more than patriotic enthusiasm, that revolution's military prospects remained hopeless despite Trenton's temporary success. Men who had stood firm at Assunpink Creek now ran from combat that looked too similar to previous disasters where British bayonets had broken American lines and turned battles into massacres. The moment of panic threatened to end not just battle but entire Princeton campaign and possibly Revolutionary War itself if British could complete rout and pursue fleeing Americans back toward Trenton, where Cornwallis would discover what had happened and move to crush Washington's scattered forces. Everything Washington had achieved since Trenton was dissolving in minutes of combat that revealed Continental Army's fundamental weakness when fighting British regulars without advantages of surprise or favorable terrain. The brink of disaster had arrived again, as it had so many times during this terrible war, and only extraordinary leadership or remarkable fortune could save American cause from collapse that seemed inevitable, as British drove forward and Americans ran, and victory appeared certain to troops who had experience winning such moments through professional superiority and ruthless pursuit of broken enemies. He rode into the smoke straight toward the enemy. Washington saw his line collapsing and made split-second decision that defined his leadership and possibly saved the revolution from destruction at Princeton. He spurred his horse forward into midst of retreating soldiers, riding directly toward British line that was advancing with bayonets fixed and muskets ready to fire at point-blank range. His physical courage in that moment was extraordinary even by standards of era when generals regularly exposed themselves to enemy fire. Washington rallied, fleeing men by personally leading counterattack within yards of British soldiers who could easily have shot him from his horse and ended both the battle and revolutionary cause through death of irreplaceable commander. He shouted encouragement and orders while positioning himself where every American soldier could see that their general was not running but attacking, not accepting defeat but demanding that his army follow him back into combat against enemy that had just broken their line. The defining act of courage transformed panic into renewed determination, as soldiers who had been fleeing seconds earlier stopped and turned and followed their general back toward British troops who were shocked to see beaten enemy, suddenly counterattacking with commander riding at their front. Washington's personal example communicated that defeat was not inevitable, that courage could overcome fear, that leadership meant sharing danger rather than directing from safety. Officers who witnessed the moment later described it as miraculous intervention that saved battle and possibly war. His aides begged him to pull back from positions so exposed that British fire would almost certainly kill him, but Washington ignored pleas and remained at front of counterattack until certain that his army had recovered its nerve and would continue fighting. The moment revealed what made Washington indispensable, not tactical genius or strategic brilliance, but moral courage that inspired ordinary soldiers to attempt extraordinary things because they trusted general who would never ask them to. Face dangers he avoided himself. The line steadied and roared back. Continental troops regrouped behind Washington's leadership and overwhelmed British regiments through weight of numbers and determination that British had not expected from enemy that had been running moments earlier. The counterattack succeeded because American soldiers found courage they had temporarily lost, because British were surprised by sudden reversal, and because Washington's presence at front of attack communicated that this moment was decisive and required everything they had left to give. The disciplined British retreat demonstrated professional training even in defeat, as officers maintained formation and prevented rout that would have turned tactical withdrawal into catastrophic collapse. But they were leaving the field to Washington's army, abandoning positions they had held and yielding honor they had expected to win through victory over inferior colonial forces. The psychological impact exceeded tactical significance. American troops had broken and then recovered to defeat British regulars in direct combat without advantages of surprise or terrain that had enabled Trenton victory. The fighting ended with American forces controlling battlefield and British regiments withdrawing toward Princeton in good order, but clearly defeated in engagement they should have won easily. Continental soldiers could barely comprehend what they had accomplished, recovering from panic to win battle against professional troops through combination of leadership and collective courage that transformed them temporarily into army, capable of matching British regulars in combat that tested both sides' resolve and training. Washington had turned disaster into triumph through personal intervention at a moment when everything hung in balance. His willingness to risk his life rallying troops demonstrated leadership that inspired loyalty beyond what orders or discipline could command, creating bond between general and soldiers that would sustain Continental Army through years of hardship still ahead. By sunrise, the impossible had happened again. American troops seized Princeton after British defenders withdrew from town. They could no longer hold against Continental forces that had defeated rearguard and now threatened to capture entire garrison. The victory brought tangible spoils, prisoners, military supplies, and British prestige damaged severely by second unexpected defeat in 10 days. American soldiers who had known only retreat and defeat until Trenton now celebrated twin victories that transformed their understanding of what Continental Army could achieve. The jubilation was genuine and profound among men who had doubted their ability to win battles against professional soldiers, but now had proven themselves capable of defeating British forces through courage and leadership that compensated for inferior training and equipment. The psychological transformation mattered more than military gains. Soldiers who believe they can win fight differently than soldiers who expect defeat, and Princeton convinced Continental troops that they could match British regulars if circumstances favored bold action and if leadership exploited opportunities that careful caution would never create. Princeton completed campaign that began with Trenton's Christmas miracle and continued through Washington's escape from Cornwallis's trap, and culminated in morning victory that demonstrated Continental Army's growing competence and determination. The twin battles changed war's trajectory by proving that American resistance was sustainable and that British military superiority was not overwhelming when Continental forces were properly led and motivated. Momentum shifted from British confidence toward American hope. The impossible had happened again through combination of Washington's leadership, soldiers' courage, and British overconfidence that created opportunities for American victories that conventional military analysis said should never occur. Revolution survived another crisis, and emerged stronger from experience of winning battles that seemed unwinnable before they were fought and won. When Cornwallis returned, there was no enemy left to fight. The British commander discovered his main force had been outmaneuvered brilliantly, and his rear destroyed by enemy he had believed trapped and helpless at Assunpink Creek. Washington had escaped impossible situation through deception and bold maneuver that left Cornwallis chasing ghosts, while real American army struck Princeton and disappeared into New Jersey highlands before British could respond, effectively to catastrophe that should never have occurred. Cornwallis experienced strategic shock as he processed how completely Washington had reversed situation from apparent American defeat to British disaster. The general who had gone to sleep confident of crushing rebellion at dawn awoke to find his opponent gone, his supply base captured, and his military reputation damaged by campaign that showcased American audacity and British complacency. The psychological impact on British command was significant. Washington was clearly more dangerous opponent than they had assumed, capable of strategic moves that required respect and caution rather than contempt and overconfidence. Strategic situation in New Jersey was transformed overnight as Washington slipped the noose that should have strangled Continental Army and struck mortal blow to British control of province that they had occupied confidently after driving Americans across Delaware. British forces would now retreat toward New York, abandoning interior New Jersey to American control and demonstrating that British military superiority could not prevent determined resistance from achieving local victories that accumulated into strategic advantage for revolution. Cornwallis had been outgeneraled by colonial amateur, who lacked formal military training but possessed instinct for warfare that professional education could not teach. The campaign demonstrated that Revolutionary War would not be easy British victory, that London expected but prolonged struggle against enemy that would not surrender despite defeats and would exploit every British mistake with bold actions, that defied conventional military wisdom about how weaker forces should behave when confronting superior opponents. They vanished into the hills, untouchable at last. Washington retreated into New Jersey highlands around Morristown, where defensible terrain and distance from British bases provided security that Continental Army desperately needed after weeks of constant campaigning. The army could finally rest and regroup, recovering from exhaustion and integrating new recruits attracted by Trenton and Princeton victories that made Continental service seem like fighting for winning cause rather than doomed rebellion. Morristown became winter headquarters, where Continental Army transformed from desperate refugee force into more professional military organization. Survival had become strength through campaign that demonstrated American capacity for sustained resistance and successful offensive operations when opportunities existed. Training improved as experienced officers incorporated lessons from recent battles. Discipline tightened as Army established permanent camp, and morale soared as soldiers recognized they had accomplished something extraordinary during dark winter that could easily have destroyed revolutionary cause completely. The birth of professional army occurred gradually through combination of successful combat experience, improved organization, and growing confidence that Continental forces could match British regulars when properly led and motivated. The ragtag collection of militia and short-term volunteers who had crossed Delaware on Christmas night was evolving into army capable of sustaining multi-year war against professional British forces who would have to take American military capabilities seriously after Trenton and Princeton demonstrated that Continental Army was dangerous opponent rather than minor irritant to be suppressed easily. Washington used winter months to rebuild and strengthen army that had survived its darkest period and emerged capable of winning battles that seemed impossible before they were fought. The Highlands protected Continental forces from British attacks, while allowing American patrols to control much of New Jersey and demonstrate that British could not occupy territory without overwhelming force that they lacked resources to maintain everywhere simultaneously. The world saw a different America now. Princeton transformed war's perception in ways that extended far beyond military significance of single battle or even combined impact of Trenton and Princeton victories. France began taking serious notice of American Revolution after dismissing it previously as doomed colonial uprising that would collapse before French intervention could be justified to European powers watching for opportunity to weaken. Britain but unwilling to support obviously failing cause. French officials calculated that American independence might actually be achievable if Continental Army could sustain resistance demonstrated during winter campaign, making French military and financial support potentially worthwhile investment in weakening Britain rather than wasteful expenditure on rebellion that would fail regardless of French assistance. The strategic implications were enormous. French entry into war would transform colonial rebellion into global conflict that would strain British resources and provide Americans with naval support and military supplies essential for defeating British forces in America. Morale surged throughout colonies as news of Princeton spread, and populations that had been demoralized by months of defeats now celebrated victories that proved revolution could succeed despite British military superiority. Enlistments rose as men who had hesitated to join losing cause now volunteered for army that had demonstrated competence and fighting spirit during winter campaign. Congress found renewed energy and purpose, legislating more effectively now that military situation no longer seemed hopeless and political independence no longer seemed like empty declaration unsupported by military capacity to defend it. The revolution no longer looked doomed but destined, though years of hard fighting remained before independence would be secured and recognized internationally. Princeton marked psychological turning point where American success seemed possible rather than miraculous, where continued resistance seemed sustainable rather than desperate, and where British victory seemed uncertain rather than inevitable, despite their overwhelming advantages in military resources and professional expertise. With 2,000 against 8,000, he didn't just win a battle, he saved a revolution. Princeton campaign showcased Washington's genius for deception, timing, and moral courage that transformed impossible situations into American victories through bold action that conventional commanders would never have attempted. The campaign required leaving fires burning while army escaped through darkness, marching exhausted troops through freezing night, attacking British rear while trapped by superior force, and personally rallying broken line through courage that inspired soldiers to follow him back into combat they had been fleeing. Reflection on campaign reveals that military genius sometimes appears as audacity rather than careful planning, as willingness to risk everything on single gamble rather than preserve forces through cautious defensive strategy. Washington understood that revolution's survival required victories that would sustain morale and demonstrate American capacity for military success, making risks of offensive operations worthwhile despite dangers of destruction if gambles failed. His leadership combined strategic vision with personal courage in ways that made impossible victories achievable through combination of surprise, determination, and enemy overconfidence. Washington's victory at Princeton proved that revolution's power was not in numbers or resources or training, but in resolve to continue fighting despite defeats and disadvantages that would have convinced rational calculation to surrender. The campaign demonstrated that weaker side could win through bold action and effective leadership, when stronger side made mistakes that audacious opponents exploited ruthlessly. American success came not from matching British strength, but from avoiding British strength while striking British weakness with timing and surprise that created temporary advantages. The legacy of Princeton extends beyond winter campaign to encompass entire Revolutionary War's lesson that determined resistance by populations committed to self-governance can defeat superior military forces through sustained effort and willingness to continue fighting when conventional wisdom counsels surrender. Washington saved revolution by refusing to accept defeat as inevitable, proving that resolve matters more than resources, when cause is just and leadership is capable, and soldiers are willing to sacrifice for principles they believe transcend their individual survival. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.